So good evening. Hello. Thank you so much for coming out this evening to our third and final lecture in our three-part series about the Washington House at Ferry Farm project, which is quickly drawing to a close. Our ribbon cutting event coming up on October 7th, which I hope everyone will come out and join us for. Certainly will be a big moment for all of us that have been working on it all this time, but I think it'll be a really big moment for the community as well. It should be very exciting. So I am Megan Budinger. I'm the Director of Curatorial Operations at the George Washington Foundation, which is just a fancy way of saying I'm the curator at both Kenmore and Ferry Farm. And I am here tonight to talk to you about sort of that final phase of the Washington House, which is the interior, the furnishings of the house, and how we're going to put it back the way we believe it was when the Washingtons lived there. Now, before I actually get into that, I thought I would start off with a little bit of a talk about what exactly a curator is and what exactly a curator does, because I suspect there's a lot of confusion out there about what exactly a curator is. To be perfectly honest, the job has changed a lot in the last maybe 25, 30 years. It's a very different thing, different beast than it used to be. And so I thought I'd give you a little bit of insight in that because it might kind of help you understand why I'm talking about all the things that I am tonight. So this is just meant to be funny, but that is the traditional view, I guess, of what a museum curator is. They used to be, in the traditional view of a curator, is that they are the people that learn some niche history aspect or aspect of art, and they know everything about it, and they are tasked with collecting the best, most perfect examples of objects within their niche area, their specialty. And then they're tasked with putting those objects together in lovely displays for the public to enjoy. That's sort of the traditional view of a curator. Well, the world has changed greatly, and these days the curator really is not expected usually to be a specialist in one specific area, but rather to have a broad base of knowledge in a lot of different areas that sort of all relate to each other. And this has become very, very true in recent years with historic sites and historic house museums placing sort of a greater and greater emphasis on historical accuracy and presenting life the way it would have been in all its great detail, but maybe not necessarily so perfect. Not everything is the best, the greatest example that we could find in an antique or a work of art. It's what exemplifies the way life would have been most exactly. And the reason for that change in emphasis, that sort of increasing awareness of historical accuracy, there's a lot of reasons for it. But I think probably the biggest one, and certainly the one I'll be talking about the most tonight, is that in this day and age we now have the means, the skills, the tools at our disposal to do really nearly forensic investigations of our historic sites and our historic house museums. And those processes, those investigations have really opened up a world of information that we never had before, that we were never really able to use before, and now we can. And in order to interpret all of that information, you sort of have to broaden your base a little bit. And it's a change, it's different, and curators, like everybody else, don't like change very much. But it's been a lot of fun, and I have to say that it's been a change in my world, but it's been something that I'm very entertained by in the last few years, and really enjoyed learning all of these new and different things that I really never thought that I would ever have a hand in, but it's been very interesting. Now, let's see. Those of you who have followed the blog, The Rooms at Kenmore, or followed our restoration over at Kenmore, the mansion right here downtown that belonged to Betty Washington Lewis and her husband Fielding Lewis, may recognize the name of this lecture this evening. It's entitled The Rooms at Ferry Farm. Well, we got that from the fact that our restoration project at Kenmore was called The Rooms at Kenmore. And the two projects, the effort to refurnish Kenmore following its restoration and the effort to furnish Ferry Farm, or the Washington House at Ferry Farm after its completion, are actually very similar. They share a lot of the same kinds of sources of information, and the product will be a little bit different, but the two projects had a lot in relation with each other. So we've kind of honed our skills of using all of the scientific information at Kenmore, and now we're using all of those skills at Ferry Farm. So at Kenmore, we found things like a teeny tiny little tack in the floor of the dining room under that orange arrow that you see there. And we took that with information that we got when we ripped out the shelves in the dining room closet, and those little pieces of information put together told us that this is what the dining room at Kenmore looked like. So there's a lot to be learned from these forensic investigations, and let me tell you, if we had only been using the documentary record, only historic documents, that's not what the dining room at Kenmore would have looked like after the refurnishing was over. There was a lot of information that we didn't have in the documentary record, and so those forensic investigations were really important. They're very important at Ferry Farm as well. Okay, so enough of that. We'll move on to the Washington House and getting it furnished. And we're starting here, the jumping off point, with Augustine Washington's Probate Inventory, which was recorded July 1st, 1743. Now, for those of you who might not be familiar with probate inventories, just a quick primer on them. They are fantastic documents, and curators get incredibly excited when they survive for their historic house museum or their historic site because they're a wealth of information. It's literally an inventory, a list, room by room, of the contents of a house that's conducted for tax purposes, usually after the death of the master of the household or the head of the household. And when they survive for your particular site or your particular house, it's good luck, and it's a wealth of information. And we're very lucky that the inventory for the Washington House at Ferry Farm survives, and as well as the Healy Lewis's inventory for Kenmore survives as well. So I've lucked out at both sites. Now, excuse me, I'm starting to get those fall allergies, so if my voice wavers a little bit tonight, I apologize in advance. Now, Augustine Washington's probate inventory, on the surface is very typical. There are no earth-shattering earthquakes here. It's pretty standard. He had 6 tables, he had 15 chairs of various different kinds, he had some glassware, he had some china, a few luxury items like a looking glass, a few things like that. On the surface, it's almost a boring inventory, but it did not take very long in our investigations to start finding some interesting little mysteries in his probate inventory. And I just finished saying how great probate inventories are and how much curators love them. I also should say this up front as well. You can't trust them 100%. They are, and this is very important to remember, they are snapshots of one day, of 1 month, of 1 year in the life of a household. And they're usually done after a very, very chaotic upheaval in the life of that household, such as the death of the owner. And so they can lie to you, they can mislead you, and so you never trust them 100%. So when I say that this was a pretty boring inventory on the surface, it got more interesting as things went on. So the first item that led us down our first rabbit hole investigations into the furnishings at Ferry Farm was this one line item. This is a detail from the second page of the inventory for the listings in the parlor. And in case you can't read that, I'll read it out loud. It says, lumber in the room and cupboard, C-U-B-B-O-R-D, worth 15 shillings. Okay, that doesn't sound that hard, right? And none of those are words that any of us are unfamiliar with. We should be able to figure this out pretty easily. But when you start to think about it, it gets a little strange. So, okay, the inventory taker found lumber, apparently, in the room that was worth 15 shillings, okay, and it was apparently being stored in a cupboard, okay, that's what C-U-B-B-O-R-D is, but it's in the parlor. Well, I don't know about you, but I don't tend to keep my excess lumber in my living room, and I'm sure probably most of you don't either. And although they did do some strange things in their rooms in the 18th century, they did not keep lumber in the parlor either. So what exactly are they talking about here? Well, in the 18th century, lumber in a probate inventory is not talking about wood. It's not talking about, piles of building materials. Lumber is a word that they use to describe junk, essentially. Odds and ends, a mishmash of objects that have no thematic connection or really of no value. So basically what the inventory taker is saying here is that the Washingtons have a junk closet in their parlor. And immediately that made me feel so much closer to the Washingtons, because I'm sure you all have a junk drawer in your houses as well. Well, Mary Washington did too, and it was in her parlor. And so that was kind of a funny thing, you know, that in the best room of the house, they've got a closet full of junk, essentially. But that's not all that one line item told us. So back to that detail again. So remember I said it gave a valuation of 15 shillings. Well, that valuation is actually for the lumber, for the junk in the cupboard. It's not for the cupboard itself. There's no value given for the cupboard. Well, that seems a little odd, because usually a case piece, a cupboard, anything that has an exterior wooden box that contains things, a case piece, would be a very valuable piece of furniture, and that almost assuredly would show up in a probate inventory. So why isn't it given a value in this inventory? Well, the answer is most likely that it's not a freestanding piece of furniture. It was built into the structure of the house, so the inventory taker considered it part of the architecture, part of the house, and didn't give it a separate value. And in the 18th century, if you are a built-in, not freestanding cupboard, you're most likely a corner cupboard. So that's usually what they were at the time period, in the time period. So we now know that the parlor had a corner cupboard in one room, in the parlor specifically, and it was full of junk. We're learning all kinds of things here. Now we had to decide, now that we knew that there was a corner cupboard in the parlor, what kind of corner cupboard to put in. And they came in kind of a variety of shapes and sizes in the 18th century. There was the sort of practical, enclosed kind, like these three examples that you see here. They were all doors. They're kind of a little more utilitarian, and they would have really been to hide your junk and your cleaning supplies, maybe extra dishes for the dining room, that sort of thing. Not things that you wanted to publicly display. And then there are the much fancier variety that have the glass glazed doors on the front, similar to these, that would have been meant much more to display things that you wanted people to see, things that you were particularly proud of, objects of status, fine ceramics, that sort of thing. And then there were the types that sort of combined these two functions. Had a lower cabinet that you would store the junk in, and the upper display shelves. So which kind did we want at Ferry Farm? Well, if you went just with the probate inventory, well, clearly we want just the practical kind, because it tells us there's junk being stored in the cupboard. Well then, our archaeologists made a very interesting discovery that sort of changed our thinking about the corner cupboard. And it had to do with ceramic shards and glue. And some of you may have heard this story before. We've written about it on our blog a few times, and it was really a neat process. And I'm going to kind of condense it here tonight to just sort of explain how it factored into the corner cupboard. But essentially, while they were cataloging shards in our archaeology lab, began to notice that several of the pieces that were showing up exhibited this sort of dark residue on their edges. You can see in these two pictures, the one on the left sort of has a big glob of it there on the end, and the one on the right sort of has a thinner coat that overlaps the decorative interior of the piece. So they were trying to figure out what exactly this stuff was, and during the mending process, when they were putting the pieces back together again, to figure out what forms, what objects they were. In this particular case, this is a creamware punch bowl decorated, ironically, with cherries that belonged to Mary Washington. And they discovered during the mending process that this residue was actually glue, and that these pieces had not been broken over time being buried under the earth. They'd broken in the period, and then somebody had mended them in the period. Somebody had glued the pieces back together again. So, okay, big deal. One of Mary's kids, maybe George, smashed his mother's punch bowl, and she had to glue it back together again. I'm sure he was in huge trouble for it. What does that really have to do with the corner cupboard? Well, Mark Atkins, our ceramics and glass specialist at Ferry Farm, decided that she was going to take this glue thing a few steps further and do some experimenting with it. And she actually went through the process of researching glue recipes from the 18th century, believe it or not, those still survive, assembling all the ingredients and then mixing up batches of 3 different kinds of glue, and then attempting to glue ceramics back together with them to see what she could learn. After she glued the ceramics back together again, then she put them all through all kinds of tests, like filling them with water, putting a lot of weight on them, burying them in the ground, to see if she could tell which kind of glue Mary originally used. Well, it turned out that Mary used the most stinky, awful glue of all of them. It was made out of cheese, Suffolk cheese specifically. It was disgusting. And the other thing that she learned is that after these ceramics were glued back together again, they wouldn't have been useful for serving food or liquids. They wouldn't hold food or liquids anymore. So they were glued back together purely for display. They didn't have a practical function anymore. And where do you display your best ceramics in the 18th century? In a corner cupboard, in the parlor. So that told us that our corner cupboard needed to have both a storage place for junk and shelves for display of fine ceramics. And so this is the one we ended up with. It was made for us by the Colonial Williamsburg Joiner Shop. There you can see the joiners standing very proudly in front of the piece that they made. The gentleman on the right, Ted Boscana, is the master joiner, and then the three underfolk to the left are his apprentices, and the corner cupboard was actually their graduation project. So they really loved this piece a lot, and they did a lot of work on it, and we were very happy with it. And last March, they brought it to Ferry Farm and delivered it. And what you can't see in these photographs of them working incredibly hard to get this really heavy piece into the house was that there were about 30 staff members standing behind the camera watching this happen, because it was the very first piece that came into the Washington House. And so this was a big moment for all of us, and we were very excited by it. So there you go. That's a sort of through Higgins Peach Orchard way of explaining exactly how we figured out which corner cupboard we were going to end up with in the house. And but it shows you how both science and the documentary record came together to literally pick a piece of furniture. Excuse me. So the next item of the probate inventory, next mystery that the probate inventory presented us, was this one. And I'll read it out loud. In the hall, one Screntore, 13 shillings. Screntore, C-R-E-N-T-O-R-E. I'm with you. I didn't know what it was either. And it seemed that nobody could really figure out what exactly this was. Essentially, we originally thought this was just a case of phonetic spelling. They were spelling something incorrectly, and it was a very common object. We just needed to figure out what they meant by it. It took some time before we realized that, no, this might be something that no longer exists, because we're not coming up with anything. So we started looking through other primary documents, other probate inventories, other newspaper advertisements, shop ledgers, that sort of thing, trying to find early 18th century terms for furnishings that we don't use anymore, thinking that maybe that's what it was. And we started seeing references to several different spellings of a word that was kind of like what we were looking at. So first, and this is a research card from the MESDA database, and it's a transcript of a court proceeding from Wills and Deeds book, and I'll just read the first few lines for you. Whereas there hath a difference arisen between Jonathan Hanson, plaintiff, and James Brown, defendant, concerning the making of a case of drawers for Scritore, which was to have been made by the said Brown by the last of January. Scritore, C-R-I-T-O-R-E. Okay, well, it's kind of like Screntore. And next, in another research card, we found this reference for, this is a transcript of a newspaper advertisement for Gamaliel Butler, who was a cabinet maker in Annapolis, living in East Street near the dock in Annapolis, having engaged in a very good workman in the cabinet way, hereby gives notice to all gentlemen and others that he will supply them with all sorts of cabinet work, such as desks, escritoires, tables, chairs, and bedsteads, etc., etc. Escritoire. Okay. Well, these are just two examples of sort of this kind of word that we kept coming across. I'm not saying this was common. I mean, we found probably like 5 references out of all the documents we looked at. Sometimes it was scrutoire, sometimes it was scrutoire, sometimes it was scrutoire with a U. So could Screntore be yet another spelling for this word? Well, all of these words were references to a type of desk. And here you see just one example of the desk. The sort of hallmarks of this type of desk are that they have tons of little drawers and little cubby holes inside, all cleverly hidden behind a fall front that when it's closed sort of makes it look like a cabinet or a clothes press or something like that. These kinds of desks are almost universally made by Scots-Irish furniture makers that emigrated to the Virginia colony and sort of settled in the Rappahannock River Valley. And so they were purchased in large part by people who lived here in the Fredericksburg area in this general region. But they originally came from a desk that the French called an escritoire. And that's what the Scots called them as well, until they emigrated to the Virginia colony. And then within a few years, the word had been corrupted to scrutoire. And that's how the cabinet makers advertised them in their shop literature. So from escritoire, we got scrutoire, and we think that's what a screen drawer is. So now we had to find a scrutoire to reproduce for the furnishings in the Washington House. And this is not an easy task. There are not that many of them left. They fell out of fashion by the middle of the 18th century, and really by 1760, nobody was making them anymore. But luckily, this is Virginia, we do have a lot of resources here. Our friends right up the road at Mount Vernon happen to have a scrutoire, circa 1745, in their collections. This is one of the earliest known that still exists. And so we use theirs as the basis for our reproduction. Now, just by happenstance, luckily, it turns out that their scrutoire was attributed to Robert Walker. Now, many of you may have heard that name before. He was a Scottish cabinet maker that emigrated to the Virginia colony about 1740 and set up shop here in Fredericksburg and in King George. And he was a fine cabinet maker, furniture maker. Lots of the locals were customers of his, including the Washingtons and the Lewises. So even if this wasn't actually the scrutoire that the Washingtons owned at Ferry Farm, they probably were very familiar with it. This is probably something that they would have seen before. So this is our reproduction that's currently on display in the visitor center at Ferry Farm, and it will be moved into the house as soon as the plaster is dry. And you can see we've modified it a little bit from the original, most notably it's not blue. We decided to leave it in its natural wood color. And on the interior, we've changed the shape and size of some of the drawers to accommodate an exhibit glass panel that we can put in there so that if we do want to display something that's original, an artifact or something like that, we have a way to protect it. And we also put our own little Ferry Farm twist on it as well. We changed out the hardware on the original for pieces that emulate fragments of hardware that were found at Ferry Farm. So this is an escutcheon in its fragmentary state that came out of the ground at Ferry Farm. And this is a reproduction escutcheon that was put on the fall front of the desk. And I should mention, if I haven't already, in case you don't already know this, all of the furnishings in the Ferry Farm house are going to be reproductions, specifically so that all of our visitors can sit on the chairs, they can pick up the plates and the cups on the table, they can open every single one of these little drawers in the scrutoire. And yes, we will actually have objects inside the drawers. So for all of you who have always hated not being able to touch in a museum, well, this will be your paradise. You'll be able to touch everything. Now, just because we have reproduced the scrutoire and we have it ready and we're going to move it into the Washington House, doesn't quite mean that I've let go of this mystery just yet, because I still want to know what happened to the Washington scrutoire. And there is this interesting document that is in the Library of Virginia manuscript holdings that's a Memorandum of Effects not mentioned in Mary Washington's will. So this is a Vendu list, a list of objects from her estate that were sold at Vendu at her house in 1789 after her death. And some kind-hearted, historically minded person actually made a list of everything that was being sold, how much it sold for, and in some cases even who bought it. I love whoever that person was. For a while it was thought that it might actually be Betty Lewis that did this during her mother's estate sale. However, the handwriting doesn't quite line up, so I'm not entirely sure that's correct. But at any rate, the second item on this list of items sold in 1789, and I know this is really hard to read, but you can see it in the detail. One piece of furniture with drawers. Now what that sentence tells me is that whoever was writing this list didn't know what to call this piece of furniture. Because the same person manages to name all the different types of tables, names all the different types of chests of drawers, names all the different types of beds, that sort of thing. Clearly is familiar with furniture, but couldn't come up with a word for this piece, and so just said, piece of furniture that has drawers. And if you or I had to describe a screw drawer to somebody who had never seen one before, the drawers kind of are its defining characteristics, and we might call it a piece of furniture with drawers as well. So there's a chance that maybe this is the screw drawer that's described in this list. And I'll wrap up by saying there's one more document in this story. And this document is actually in the Kenmore archives. And for a long time, it didn't really make a lot of sense to us. We didn't really understand what it was until we paired it with the Vendu sale list. Articles purchased by L. Lewis, 22nd December 1789. So this is Lawrence Lewis, one of Fielding and Betty Lewis's children, so Mary's grandson. And apparently, he's a young man at this point, just setting up household. He has purchased a bunch of things from his grandmother's estate sale, and this is a list of the things that he bought. And the very first item on the list is one piece of furniture with drawers. So, if that is the screw drawer that was in the Washington house, then it appears that her grandson, Lawrence Lewis, is the one that ended up with it. Now, sadly, this is where my investigation has hit the ground, so to speak. No screw drawer or anything like that shows up in any of the documents associated with Lawrence Lewis's homes at Woodlawn or Audley. So, to be continued. I haven't let go of it yet. I'm still convinced I'll find it someday, but for the moment, that's where it ends. All right, the next thing I'll talk about in the probate inventory is not a specific piece of furniture, but rather a whole room, because this is where probate inventories can kind of lead you astray. So this is the detail of the list of items that are in the parlor, listed as being in the parlor of the house. And I'll read this to you. 3 beds, 1 old table, 3 old chairs, 1 old desk, 1 looking glass, 1 set window curtains, 1 sugar box, and the aforementioned lumber in the room and cupboard. Well, if you're like me, your very first question is why are there 3 beds in the parlor? And that would be a very good question, because of all the rooms in an 18th century house, the parlor is probably the least likely one to be used for sleeping. It tends to be the best room in the house. It's reserved for entertaining, for visitors, that sort of thing. It's where the fine china is displayed in the corner cupboard. It tends to be the best room, and you wouldn't typically find beds in it. Now, one little caveat here, just to sort of help you imagine this in your heads. Usually, when a probate inventory uses the word bed, they're not referring to a 4-poster high bedstead. They're referring to what we would think of as the mattress, the feather or straw tick that would be on the bed. Usually, not always, but usually. If you see a bed listed without a bedstead, that usually means that somebody's using the mattress on the floor like a floor pallet. And then those things will be rolled up and cleared away in the morning. So just to help you picture what's going on here in the parlor, there aren't 3 massive 4-post beds sitting in the middle of the parlor. It's mattresses on the floor. Still doesn't explain why they're there, but it's a little different. And then there's the question of the word old. Well, that would seem to be self-explanatory, except when you really start to think about it. Are they talking about the fact that the furniture in the room is old, like antique, like from so long ago in 1743 that it's now antique? Or are they saying old as in worn out, shabby, run down, broken? Well, if you look at the values, you might think shabby, old, worn out, broken would be the way to go, because this is all very low valued furniture. But again, that would be odd in a parlor. It's your best room. That's not usually the room where you put your old, worn out furniture. And then there are some signs that it is still a lovely, nice room. There's a looking glass, that's a luxury item. It's the only room in the house that has window curtains, which would be expected of the best room. But then we're back to weird again with the sugar box. Here, included a picture of a sugar box. So this is basically a small blanket chest, that's what it looks like, that's divided into 2 compartments on the inside, and it's made to hold loaves of sugar. And it is true that in this time period, you would often keep expensive things like sugar and spices under lock and key in the house rather than out in the kitchen to sort of keep an eye on them. But it still would be kind of odd to have a chest full of sugar sitting in the middle of your Western entertaining room. That also is a little weird. And then we mentioned the lumber in the room and cupboard. They have a lot of junk in this room. Now, archaeologically speaking, one of the sort of strange finds in this room was the fact that there's a root cellar in this room. Again, not typical of a parlor. And in that root cellar, one of the things that was found was a concentration of wig curlers. And I think probably at this point, most of you have heard of our famous wig curlers. We have an enormous number of them at the Ferry Farm site, and some of them were found within the footprint of the house as well, like these, which seems to indicate that perhaps somebody was maintaining or taking care of wigs in the parlor. Also not an activity that you would normally see in the parlor. So what I'm getting at here is that this probate inventory doesn't seem to be sticking with what we traditionally know about parlors, and the archaeological evidence does not seem to be sticking with what we know about parlors. And so if we put all of those clues together, we sort of have to change our interpretation of what we think the Washingtons were using that room for. And so when you come to visit the Washington house, what you're going to see is a house, or a room, that's done more like a modern family room, essentially. It's the room where the family hung out. It's where they spent the bulk of their time. It didn't have the best furnishings. They weren't the worst furnishings, but they weren't the best. They had display pieces in there for when friends came to visit and they wanted to impress them a little bit. But it's also where they congregated and did things like taking care of their wigs, which I guess is what you do in the 18th century. So we're going to show it in that light rather than a pristine 18th century parlor. So we're going to be using things like the stretcher table from the Mesda collection. This has that very William and Mary or early Baroque style to it. We want people to feel when they walk into the room that they are looking at a different style than the rest of the house, an older style. We think that there's a possibility that when the Washingtons purchased the house from the Strother family who originally built it, that they may have purchased a lot of the furnishings from the Struthers as well, which would explain why they had an accumulation of old or maybe antique furniture in their parlor. So we want people to feel the difference in the age of the furnishings. So the stretcher table is one example. This will be the style of chair that's in the room. It's a circa 1720 piece made in England from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. It has that very sort of heavy wood look to it. And we will show activities that we think happened in that room, such as caring for your wigs, which was a very messy process. So there will be a curtain strung across one corner of the room to make a makeshift powder room, a place where you would go and sit and have your powder applied to your wig. And we'll have things like the wig curlers and other wig maintenance accessories sitting around the room. And because there's a desk, an old desk, listed in this room, we'll also use it to sort of illustrate the idea that it may have been somewhat of Mary's office as well, where she's sort of running the household, keeping expensive food stores like the sugar nearby where she can keep an eye on them, and running the household accounts and whatnot from the desk. The desk is also a piece from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. So it won't be your traditional, rather stuffy 18th century parlor. It will be the Washington's parlor, because all of these things that we have learned thus far give us more of an idea of what they themselves were like and how they lived in their house. And that's that level of historical accuracy that we're trying to get at with what we're doing at Ferry Farm. All right, now last thing that I'm going to talk about from the probate inventory, because I hopefully will save a little bit of time for questions here. There are some areas of the probate inventory that are incredibly vague, incredibly vague, and they're kind of key areas that are rather necessary for showing how a family lived in the house. And so we're relying almost entirely on archaeology to sort of fill in these holes. And one of them is the ceramics in the household, the chinawares. There are listings in the probate inventory for chinawares, but as you can see, they're kind of spotty. Okay, we've got a large bowl, then there's a large gilt bowl, there's 2 dishes, 9 custard cups for some reason, 4 coffee cups, and 11 plates. So if we wanted to set the table in the Washington house, all we really got to go on is they had 11 plates. There's really no descriptive information there. There's really nothing much to go on. So archaeology to the rescue. And in the massive quantities of ceramic shards that they have been cataloging and analyzing, they've managed to identify 2 decorative plate rims on white salt glazed stoneware, or WSG as we call it, that they think that these are the everyday plates that the Washingtons were using on a regular basis. These 2 kind of molded rims are called dot diaper basket, which you see on the left, and barley corn, which you see on the right. Interestingly enough, the same plates were being used at Kenmore as well. Found that through the archaeology as well. But while they were analyzing the different ceramic shards to figure out what kind of plates they had, Mara, our ceramics and glass specialist, also came up with these pieces that she found that were looking very, very familiar to her. And the reason they were looking very familiar to her is because she'd seen almost identical pieces in the Kenmore archaeology. And it's a little more unusual than with the plates because these pieces are to a very fine, very rare, and rather expensive molded decorated fruit dish. And it would be highly unusual for two households to have one of these things. They're rather expensive and rather rare. Would have been hard to get at the time. We'll take it one step further. We also learned from our colleagues at Mount Vernon that they too had found fragments of the same fruit dish there. So this is now 3 Washington family houses associated with the Washington family, that are using the same rare and exotic fruit dish. What does that mean exactly? We're not 100% sure. Maybe Mary is gifting them to her children when they leave home. Maybe the family is placing ceramic orders across the pond, and when they come in, they're divvying up the goods amongst the family households. We're not really sure, but it's kind of a neat connection, and it's one we'll keep working on. And just completely by coincidence, we discovered that after Mara identified this fruit dish, turned out we had an intact example of it in the Kenmore collection already. It had just been collected because it was a beautiful piece from the right time period. We had no idea of the connection to the Washingtons at the time. So this fruit dish is the intact version of what those fragments came from, and it's now on display at Kenmore. Circa 1740, as you see there. Okay, this next batch is one I have to kind of chuckle about. So this is Mary's teawares. And for as vague as the probate inventory is about all the other ceramics in the house, it goes into a lot of detail about the teawares. And I laugh because I've been told by our friends in the archaeology lab that probably the largest number of fragments that they find in the assemblage is from teawares. As Mara says, Mary literally had teawares out the wazoo. She had tea sets galore. And so it's kind of ironic that the probate inventory goes into such great detail about the teawares. So let's break this down a little bit. The first batch that it discusses are 9 gilt saucers, 6 gilt cups, 1 teapot or gilt teapot, 1 milk pot, 1 slop bowl and butter dish, 1 teapot, stand, and spoon boat. So basically what they're telling us that gilt is probably a reference to gilding, probably on an Amari-style Chinese export porcelain teaware. And here you can see 2 examples of Amari Chinese export porcelain. Amari tends to be the sort of orange and blue colorway, oftentimes showing gilding. And then the pieces that were used with it are not identified or not described, but there's so much white salt glazed stoneware in the fragments that we think that'd be a safe thing to show being used with these pieces. And this is an important point to make. In this time period, they're not buying tea sets as matching sets. So nobody's teawares matched. They would collect pieces as they were able to find them. They might have a particular colorway that they really liked or a certain pattern that they really liked, and so they tried to keep them in that line, but the teawares didn't really match, and they didn't think anything of that. In fact, the more variety you could show on your table, the better. It showed that you had a better collection. So that's an important thing to remember. They didn't actually have tea sets the way we think of them today. And the second batch of teawares that's described here is 8 blue cups and saucers, 1 slop bowl and teapot, 1 milk pot and stand and sugar dish. And blue is probably a reference to blue and white Chinese export porcelain, similar to this. So that will be the other set that we show in the house. Now, I hope someday that we are able to have examples of all of Mary's teawares in the house because they're impressive. For now, we're starting out with these 2 groups because we have them in the probate inventory. But someday, I hope we have teawares out the wazoo as well. And then we move on to glass. If you believe the probate inventory, the Washingtons did not have much. In fact, getting a drink in this house must have been a little tough. There's 1 decanter, 1 mug, 3 tumblers, and a bunch of salt cellars. Of course, archaeology has proven that wrong. There's far more to choose from. In fact, some really neat things. These fragments are from an engraved flip glass. This little fragment actually helps figure out what that decanter might have looked like. You can see that fragment is probably from the neck of this glass decanter. And this fragment is a little hard to see, but you can kind of make out the air twist decoration going through the center of it. This is the stem of a wine glass. And this is a complete example of what that wine glass might have looked like. And we think this is what would have been on the Washington table for dinner, with those white salt glazed stoneware plates. And then this one, this is kind of a mind-blowing one, and it's not typical of what they would have used on a daily basis, but it's kind of fun, so I wanted to throw it in there. This little teeny tiny fragment is from this incredible piece of glass. So this is a Venetian wine goblet, and you can see that red circle kind of shows you where that little piece would have been. So this is just a display piece. They're not drinking wine out of this. This would have been on that corner cupboard in the parlor. But it's a neat piece, not something we expected to find. And the last thing that I will talk about in the probate inventory, is another really basic item that it doesn't give us much information about, and that's utensils. What were these people eating with? If the probate inventory is to be believed, apparently they had one large soup spoon that they just passed around at meals, which seems unlikely, and indeed it is. Again, probate inventories, don't take them at face value. So Laura Galkey, who's here this evening, has identified quite a few different fragments and utensils in small finds, including this. This is a fork. It would have been a 2-time fork without its handle. And here we have fragments of a knife blade, and better yet, for what my purposes are, fragments of the bone handle that would have been attached to the knife and probably to the fork as well, with this decorative cross-hatching motif on it, which I'm going to have a really hard time finding that as a reproduction to put in the Washington house, but still it gives me something to aim for, so that's exciting. And we also know what the soup's going to look like too, if anybody's interested. So I think, yes, I've decided to leave it there so that we have time for questions if you have any. I will say in conclusion that the science of history, which is something that we talk about a lot at both Ferry Farm and Kenmore, is really sort of the wave of the future in the Historic House Museum world, I think. It's not just a cold analysis of scientific facts and research. It actually sheds some light on who these people were and what their lives were like, and it helps us better interpret for the public, for you all, what their lives were like in these houses. And I hope that you will come to Ferry Farm and see it all very soon, coming up in October. So thank you very much. Okay. There we go. So any questions? Yes, sir.
2 questions. One, what's a slop hole? Number 2, the 3 beds, were they used for the slaves at nighttime? Sorry.
2 very good questions. So a slop bowl, first of all, not something we use too terribly much, but it was considered an integral piece of a proper tea service at the time. It's where you dumped, it was just a bowl that you dumped all your tea leaves in after you made your tea. And so a slop bowl was always part of a tea service. It was always important. So there's usually one with every list of implements. Now, as for the beds and the slaves, that is a question that we have entertained. That's a notion that we've entertained. I don't think we have enough information to be able to say definitively one way or the other whether that's a possibility. Sleeping arrangements for the enslaved at this time, we're talking about early and mid 18th century, are very different from sort of our traditional view of pre-Civil War plantation life. We know there was a slave quarter at Ferry Farm, but if there were house slaves that might be quartered in the house in some capacity, that's entirely possible. It still would seem like a very odd thing to have them quartered in the parlor. Amongst the staff, we all have lots of theories about this, and there is some line of thought that maybe it's as simple as, Augustine Washington had just passed away. Maybe a lot of friends and family were visiting there to pay their respects, and maybe they just put some temporary extra bedding in the parlor for that reason. Entirely possible. That's why probate inventories can lie to you. Laura and I have talked about, I really like her theory that maybe the Washingtons were very hospitable people, and they had that ferry that docked there at their property, and there were a lot of travelers coming pretty much right across their property. And if you saw a chimney and it was late in the evening and you needed a place, you might knock on that door, and maybe that happened to the Washingtons quite a bit, and so they needed extra bedding. That sounds good to me. There are lots of different options. The slavery one is one that we have considered. I just don't think we have enough to say whether it's possible or not. Yeah.
Since it was by a ferry, was there any record of the Washingtons charging people for food or lodging?
No, I don't think. Have you ever come across anything, Laura?
No, and you wouldn't do that. You would take people in. There weren't places to stay. When you were traveling, you'd look, you'd count how many chimneys. You wanted more than one chimney. The Washingtons have 3. And so this is a place that can put you up well. But you don't take money from folks. It's just part of Virginia hospitality at that time.
Exactly. This is sort of one of the reasons why the Washingtons they didn't like that ferry being there so terribly much. They didn't own the ferry. It's a common misconception. They didn't make money off of the ferry. It's how the property got the name. They didn't actually make any money from it. And so it was always a little bit of a hassle for them, all of the people coming to and fro on the highway and off of the ferry as well. Yeah.
Who would have done the probate inventory, and would that person have been susceptible to bribes or favors or?
The answer to the second part, absolutely. It happened all the time when probate inventories were taken. And as soon as I walked in here tonight, I knew somebody was going to ask me who the inventory takers were. There were 3 of them, and I know one of them was a Thornton. And after that, my mind just blanked on who the other 2. I'm looking at my colleagues back there, and I'm seeing some blank stares. So apparently, we've all blanked this evening on who the 3 of them are. But
Very honest people.
We're very honest, exactly. So yes, is that a helpful addition, Cash?
Yeah. Generally, these are officers of the court. They would be appointed by the county court justices, and usually they are coming from the same social strata as the person that they are inventorying. So it would have been peers of the Washington family.
Benjamin Merriman, there's another one. See, I'm starting to pull them out. But yes,
I think the third one's Jackson.
Jackson? That sounds good. we can get you that information though. But yes, Cash is exactly right. They're usually appointed by the court to do this, but quite often you knew they were your neighbors. You knew who they were. We know, we speculate very strongly at Kenmore that there are certain things that were left out of the inventory there that we know were in the house that may have been trundled out the front door as the inventory takers were coming in the back door. So yes, that did happen quite often, and I can see where it would be an easy thing to have happen. It may explain some of the gaps in a lot of these inventories. Yes?
Where is the probate inventory today?
Where is it? It's in the county court book.
Is that King George or?
Well, actually, so this is complicated. It's actually down at the Library of Virginia now. It's part of the project to digitize a lot of the local court records, which sadly is taken forever at the Library of Virginia. So I think now you have to go make an appointment in order to be able to see it. But eventually the hope is that it will be digitized and then the originals will be returned to the localities. But, so yes, at the moment I believe it's at the Library of Virginia in Richmond.
But you can Google it. They're copies.
That's a good point, yeah.
Copies. So
Yeah.
if you don't need to see the original, you can certainly see.
Yes.
And transcriptions, glorious transcription.
Yes, luckily it's a well-studied inventory, so it is widely available. Some of the other ones, for lesser-known folks, it can be a challenge to locate those, especially when they've gone down to Richmond.
Would it be returned to Stafford County or to King George County?
That's a good question. I guess Stafford, I would assume that's where it departed from. So I would guess it would go back to the Stafford courthouse. That would be my guess. Yes?
Ditto on the, does that stand for ditto?
Ditto.
Or something like that?
Yes, I'm sorry, I glossed over that. I probably should have mentioned that. In probate inventory terminology, ditto means use the descriptor from the item above. So if something, you have one blue saucer and the next line is one ditto cup, you're supposed to take the descriptor from the line above and apply it to the cup. So when they stop using ditto, that means the descriptors no longer count. So
So
this is very confusing.
When did ditto become used? I'd always thought it was more recent.
Oh,
Really old?
No, it's Latin, so it's been around for quite some time, and the earliest probate inventories I can think of, I can recall having seen it used there. So I think it's been pretty standard terminology since time immemorial. Yeah. Anything else? All right. Okay. Well, thank you all very much for coming out.